It is the early hours of April 9th, 1917. The ground near Arras, France, is frozen solid, the kind of cold that gets into the bones of men who have been digging for weeks. Along a front stretching nearly 2.5 kilometers, British engineers crouch in shallow pits, their breath misting in the dark. Each man holds his breath as he makes the final connections. The officers stand back, further back than you might expect, given that the enemy trenches are only a few hundred meters away. They are not standing back because of the Germans. They are standing back because of what is buried behind them. At precisely 5:15 in the morning, an electrical signal pulses through a buried wire. 2,000 iron cylinders, each packed with nearly 30 kilograms of phosgene gas and buried at a precise angle in the earth, fire simultaneously. The sound is not a series of shots. It is a single, colossal thud, a concussive wall of pressure that knocks men off their feet half a kilometer away. For a fraction of a second, the British front line simply disappears behind a curtain of smoke and fire. Then the cylinders are gone, arcing silently through the pre-dawn sky in great parabolic curves, and the men who fired them are already running. What follows, in the German trenches, is something close to apocalypse. This is the story of the Livens projector, a weapon so simple it could be built with a section of drainpipe and a tin of explosive, and yet so devastatingly effective that it changed the nature of chemical warfare overnight. It was conceived by a man who despised the war, built by engineers who were terrified of their own creation, and deployed on a scale that the generals themselves could barely comprehend. It was never celebrated. It was barely even acknowledged. And for most of the century that followed, it was almost entirely forgotten. But the Livens projector deserves to be remembered, not as a curiosity, but as one of the most elegant and terrifying inventions the First World War produced. Because understanding what it was requires understanding what came before it, and what came before it was a catastrophe. By the summer of 1915, gas had already become one of the most feared weapons on the Western Front. The German release of chlorine at Ypres on April the 22nd, 1915 had demonstrated, with horrible clarity, that chemical weapons could break a front line that artillery alone could not. The greenish-yellow cloud that drifted towards Allied trenches that afternoon killed an estimated 1,000 men and sent 4,000 more choking and blinded to the rear. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line. The war had changed. Britain responded with haste and improvisation. Cylinders of chlorine were shipped to France and buried in the British trenches, connected to pipes that would release the gas towards the enemy when the wind was right. This method, known as the cylinder release or simply the cloud attack, had an obvious and fatal flaw. It required the wind to blow in exactly the right direction at exactly the right speed. Too fast, and the gas dispersed before reaching the enemy. Too slow, and it lingered in no man's land, doing little. And if the wind changed, which on the Western Front it had a persistent habit of doing, the gas came back. The catastrophe at the Battle of Loos in September 1915 demonstrated this with painful precision. British gas was released along a broad front, but the wind was inconsistent. In some sectors, it worked. In others, it barely moved. In at least one sector, it drifted back into British trenches. The official records are, understandably, somewhat vague on the precise casualties caused by this reversal, but the reputational damage to the entire concept of cloud gas attacks was lasting. Generals who had been enthusiastic became skeptical. Staff officers who had never liked the idea became openly hostile. The fundamental problem was this. Gas delivered by wind was uncontrollable. You could not predict where it would go, how concentrated it would be when it arrived, or whether it would arrive at all. For gas to be a reliable weapon rather than a horrifying gamble, it needed to be delivered, like a shell, like a bomb, to a specific place, at a specific time, in a specific concentration. The existing technology could not do this. What was needed was something entirely new. The man who solved this problem was not a professional soldier. William Howard Livens was a civil engineer, educated at Cambridge, who had joined the Royal Engineers in 1915 with no particular enthusiasm for military life and a great deal of resentment about the war itself. His motivation was personal. His fiancée had been aboard the Lusitania when it was torpedoed in May 1915. She survived, but Livens did not forget. He channeled his fury with considerable intelligence into the problem of killing Germans more efficiently. He began, as engineers do, by thinking about the problem from first principles. If the issue with gas was delivery, then delivery was what needed to be fixed. The cylinder release used wind as a propellant. Unreliable, uncontrollable. Artillery shells could carry gas, but the explosive charge needed to burst the shell also destroyed much of the gas inside, reducing efficiency dramatically. What was needed was a method of projecting a large quantity of gas to a specific location without destroying it in the process. The answer, as Livens eventually worked out, was almost embarrassingly simple. You needed a tube, a steel tube buried in the ground at an angle with a propellant charge at the bottom. You dropped a cylinder of gas into the tube, connected the propellant to an electrical detonator, and fired it. The gas cylinder flew through the air, like a very large, very heavy mortar bomb, and landed in the enemy trench, where the thin steel shell cracked open on impact and released the gas in a concentrated cloud, exactly where you wanted it. The genius of the system was not in any single component. Every element of the Livens projector was crude by the standards of contemporary engineering. The tubes themselves were fabricated from sections of mild steel, roughly 20 centimeters, 8 inches, in internal diameter and about 1 meter, 3 feet, in length. The projector weighed approximately 23 kilograms, heavy enough to require 2 men to carry, light enough to be moved without mechanical assistance. The gas drum that went inside was a simple pressed steel cylinder, sealed at both ends, containing roughly 28 kilograms of liquid phosgene or other chemical agent. The propellant charge was a standard cordite cartridge. There were no moving parts. There was almost nothing to go wrong. What made the Livens projector lethal was not its individual capability, but its collective one. A single projector was merely a mortar with an unusual payload. But if you buried 1,000 of them in the ground, their muzzles angled precisely to drop their loads in the same target area, and fired them simultaneously from a single electrical switch. The result was something categorically different from anything that had existed before. The projectors were manufactured primarily by the Special Brigade, Royal Engineers, who also operated them. Production numbers are not entirely clear, as much of the documentation remained classified for decades and some records were lost entirely, but estimates suggest that by 1917, the British were producing thousands of projectors per month at facilities across England. The Special Brigade trained intensively in their installation and use, developing systems for laying the projectors in shallow pits, concealing them from enemy observation, and wiring large numbers of them together in firing circuits that could be triggered from a safe distance. The process of installation was itself a remarkable piece of logistics. A battery of projectors, which might consist of anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred individual tubes, had to be dug into the earth at a consistent angle, typically between 45 and 50 degrees, all aimed at the same target. The depth of the pit, the angle of the tube, and the precise charge of propellant had to be calculated to drop the gas drums within a small target area. This was geometry and ballistics performed in the dark, under intermittent shell fire, by men who were also carrying 23-kilogram steel tubes across broken ground. The first major operational use of the Livens projector came on April 4, 1917, just 5 days before the larger Arras attack. At a site near Asheville, a battery of projectors was fired against German positions, delivering a concentrated cloud of phosgene to a specific location with a speed and density that the cylinder release could never have achieved. The results were noted. The Germans had no idea what had hit them. Then came April 9, 1917, and the Battle of Arras. The attack that morning involved 2,340 projectors, all fired simultaneously from a single electrical detonator. The gas drums, each containing phosgene, were aimed at a series of German battery positions, headquarters, and communications trenches behind the front line. When they fired, the entire payload, roughly 66 tons of phosgene, arrived at the target within a matter of seconds. There was no warning. There was no time to put on a gas mask, even for men who were wearing them around their necks. The concentration of gas was in some areas immediately lethal. German accounts of the attack describe a wall of gas appearing without any preceding sound. No prolonged hiss of a cylinder release, no warning from the characteristic noise of gas shells. One moment, the air was clear. The next, men were dying. Prisoners taken in the subsequent infantry advance reported that entire dugouts had been overcome before the occupants could react. German gas officers who examined the affected areas afterwards estimated that the concentration of phosgene in some locations was far higher than anything the cylinder release had ever achieved. The psychological effect on German forces was considerable. They knew about gas. They had masks, protocols, training, but all of that preparation had been calibrated against a warning time measured in seconds or minutes, the time it took a gas cloud to drift across no man's land. The Livens projector gave no such warning. The gas was simply there, all at once, in lethal concentration. The only defense was to be wearing your mask before the attack began. And since the attack gave no prior notice, that required knowing the attack was coming. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Records of German casualties from Livens projector attacks are incomplete and, in some cases, remain disputed. The German army was understandably reluctant to document the precise effects of chemical weapons attacks in detail, both for security reasons and, one suspects, for morale reasons. Estimates suggest several hundred deaths from the Arras attack alone, with many more incapacitated, but exact numbers are unknown. The Germans, of course, were not without ingenuity of their own. They had been developing chemical weapons since before the British, and their engineering capability was in many respects superior. But the German response to the Livens projector illustrates something important about the nature of tactical innovation. The German Gaswurfminen, gas mortar bombs, operated on a broadly similar principle, but were fired from conventional mortars rather than dedicated projectors. This meant they could be delivered in smaller numbers from existing equipment, which was logistically convenient. What they could not replicate, however, was the simultaneous mass discharge that gave the Livens projector its defining characteristic. Firing mortars sequentially, even quickly, still gave a defender precious seconds to react. The projector's simultaneous salvo did not. The Americans, who entered the war in 1917 and studied British methods with considerable interest, recognized the projector's value immediately. American forces adopted the Livens system, and American engineers worked closely with the Special Brigade to develop modifications suited to American production methods. The fundamental design, however, remained Livens's. The simplicity that made it manufacturable in Britain made it equally manufacturable in America, and by the final months of the war, Allied projector attacks were being mounted on a scale that dwarfed even the Arras operation. The French also experimented with similar systems, though their adoption was slower and their results less systematic. Among all the Allied powers, it was Britain that developed the projector to its fullest extent, and it was British engineers who understood best how to exploit its peculiar combination of simplicity and mass. By contrast, the German cylinder release, while technically capable, was being steadily abandoned by 1917 as its wind dependency made it tactically unreliable. German chemical warfare increasingly relied on artillery delivery, which was more controllable than wind but less efficient than the projector. In the final calculus of the gas war, the Livens projector represented a genuine asymmetric advantage. Assessing the actual historical impact of the Livens projector is complicated by the same factors that complicate all assessments of chemical weapons in the First World War. The records are incomplete, the post-war politics of gas warfare discouraged honest accounting, and the nature of the weapon made battlefield effects difficult to verify in the chaos of an attack. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. The projector changed the operational calculus of chemical warfare. Before it existed, gas attacks were weather-dependent, slow-developing, and largely defensible given adequate warning time. After it existed, any position within range of a projector battery was vulnerable to an overwhelming chemical attack with seconds of warning, regardless of wind direction, time of day, or weather conditions. The psychological impact on defending forces was arguably as significant as the material one. German soldiers who survived projector attacks described a particular form of dread that differed from ordinary artillery fear. Not the anticipation of incoming shells, which made a recognizable sound, but the knowledge that death could simply arrive, silently and all at once, with no warning whatsoever. That kind of uncertainty is corrosive to morale in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to understand. The weapon's influence extended beyond the First World War. The principles of the Livens projector, large bore, electrically fired, mass salvo delivery of chemical munitions, informed the development of chemical weapons delivery systems in the interwar period and beyond. Several nations studied the projector in detail during the 1920s, and elements of its design can be traced in subsequent chemical weapons development programs. Today, surviving Livens projectors can be found at the Royal Engineers Museum in Chatham, Kent, where they sit in quiet contrast to their violent history. Occasionally, construction work in northern France still unearths the buried tubes, still in the ground, exactly where the Special Brigade left them in 1917, never fired, waiting for an order that never came. The Flemish and French soil gives them up slowly, one by one, a century later. Unexploded ordnance teams handle them with considerable caution. Return, for a moment, to that pre-dawn darkness near Arras. The engineers have finished their work. 2,000 projectors are in the ground, their angles checked and rechecked, their firing circuits tested and confirmed, their gas drums nestled in steel tubes that look, to the uninitiated, like nothing more than buried drain pipes. The men who installed them are moving back, well back, to positions of relative safety, not because of the Germans who are 400 meters away and sleeping, but because of what they have built. William Livens by this stage understood better than anyone what his invention could do. He had done the calculations. He had seen the results of smaller tests. He knew that when that electrical switch was thrown, the combined payload of those 2,000 projectors would put more lethal gas into a defined target area more quickly than any weapon in history had ever managed. He had designed a machine for killing people at scale, and it worked with terrible efficiency, and he knew it. What he could not have known, what none of them could have known, was how thoroughly the weapon would be forgotten. The gas war ended with the armistice in November 1918. The Chemical Warfare Service was wound down. The Special Brigade was disbanded. The projectors were left in the ground or scrapped. The knowledge was classified, then archived, then simply lost in the ordinary bureaucratic entropy of a world that wanted, desperately, to forget that the last 4 years had happened. The Livens projector does not appear in most histories of the First World War. It rarely features in documentary accounts of the gas war. The man who invented it is not widely known outside specialist circles. There is no statue. There is no monument. The weapon that may have been the single most effective chemical delivery system of the entire conflict has been quietly absorbed into the vast and largely unexamined catalog of horrors that constitutes the Industrial War of 1914 to 1918. But consider what was achieved. A civil engineer, working from first principles with basic materials, designed in his spare time a weapon system that could deliver 66 tons of lethal gas to a specific target in less time than it takes to put on a gas mask. He built it from steel tubes and electrical wire. He fired it with a switch. And it worked. The generals who approved its use were frightened of it. The engineers who built it were frightened of it. The men who installed it, in cold and darkness with their faces inches from enough phosgene to kill a city, were very much frightened of it. They did it anyway, because the war required it of them, and because they had been told it would help to end the thing that was killing their friends. It was simple. It was brutal. It was devastatingly effective. And when it was over, the world did its best to forget that it had ever existed. Some things are too efficient to be celebrated. Some inventions are too successful to be remembered. The Liven's projector was both.